Who dat to you, Saints fans? Welcome back to the Who Dat Confessional podcast. It's episode 741, and we are deep into the offseason as we have officially entered it in for everybody. The Super Bowl has ended. The New Orleans Saints have officially hired Klint Kubiak to be their offensive coordinator, and yeah, the long wait, the long night begins. Now it's just a short 7 months before you see people in pads again. But the good news is, promise, it'll fly by, especially the older that you are, because fun facts. I don't know if you knew this, but did you know that as you get older, your brain actually remembers less things? Not because you're getting dumber, but because it simply doesn't keep copies of duplicate scenarios. So if you are to be doing the same thing over and over every day as you get older, well, the brain doesn't see a point in remembering all that, so it feels like time passes by quicker. Now, as depressing as that might sound, the positive of all that is, don't worry, football's right around the corner. Unless you're like some 20-year-old listener to the Who Dat Confessional podcast, then it's going to be forever. Who Dat to you, welcome in, glad that you're all here. Dr. Billy Oshie, Rudy, Rock, Gerald Stevenson, Jimbo, Bruno, Saints Garcia, AJ Sukina, Giovanni Martinez. How is the family doing? Give the family my best wishes. For those listening, I don't actually know Giovanni's actual family. I just assume they're with the mafia because it's safe to make that assumption. But it sounds like they're actually with multiple families. But we'll worry about that in the stream. Eric, Chemo, Who Dat, everybody coming on into the live stream. Number one, I'm assuming everybody watched the Super Bowl. Mr. Jerry, good to see you. Shout out to the Kansas City Chiefs and what might have been, as everybody knows, and as we will talk about for the rest of our adult lives, New Orleans Saints were supposed to draft Patrick Mahomes. Kansas City Chiefs traded up and took him. He has now won 3 Super Bowls and 3 Super Bowl MVPs. Now, I'm not saying it's all on him because, as y'all know who follow this show, I am not a believer. I am not a proponent, supporter, or in any form, a savant of the school that believes in quarterback wins as a stat. We don't believe that here. But I would be absolutely ridiculously wrong to insinuate, to say, or even postulate Patrick Mahomes is not a key, integral part of the Super Bowl success that Kansas City is now enjoying and a literal dynasty that has now started. Wish it was the Saints. But maybe we'll find our guy, and if Gundam comes by, I know he's going to say one name, Jaden Daniels. That's not happening. But who knows? We'll have to wait and see. The good news is, if you're a Saints fan, NFC South still sucks. The NFC as a whole seems to be the weaker of the conference right now. We'll see what that looks like in 2024. And you have a new offensive coordinator coming in Klint Kubiak, who did just help take his team to the Super Bowl, even if they lost. I know some people are going to say, hey, the 49ers couldn't score in the first quarter. They couldn't score in the third. They didn't really have some of those big moments. But I'll be honest, if I'm just being real, I don't think that the offense is why San Francisco didn't win that game. Sure, they could have done more. I just think that you had 2 really, really good teams going at it. And there's even names that connect to the New Orleans Saints from this game that might not expect. For those that don't remember, hey, Steve Spagnuolo, y'all remember that guy? Yeah, he's the defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. Yeah, remember when he was the Saints defensive coordinator? Nobody wants to. Times change so many things. A decade later, we're talking about Steve being one of the better defensive coordinators. And, it's wild what a decade can do. Wild what a decade can do. I mean, not that I think that everything that happened in 2012 was Spag's fault, but he certainly didn't have the same level of moxie and didn't have the same level of success that he is currently having now. More power to him. Maybe the New Orleans Saints can be the one that topple Patrick Mahomes at least once. Hey, they can have their dynasty, right? Tom Brady won like 17 Super Bowls. It's not about how many you have. It's about how many you allow everybody else to have. And hey, Eli Manning, he got 2 rings during the New England Patriots dynasty. So you know what? We'll see what happens. I'm going to try to approach this offseason in a very positive way, in a very hopeful way. Not to the point of ignorance, but for fun. For fun. But yeah, shout out to the Chiefs. I said a very apparently controversial statement on Twitter. I'm sorry. I thought the halftime show was a little mid. My apologies. I didn't say it was bad. I said it was mid, and people got really salty about it. Just don't really feel like that was the best halftime show. I think that Dre Snoop, 50. That was the top. Like, that was a great Super Bowl halftime show anyway. Apparently that was not the right thing to say. That went bad. But yeah, I thought it was mid. I didn't think, and again, I don't think it's bad, but like, what I put in my top 10 Super Bowl halftime shows? No. Is it up there with Michael Jackson? No, not at all. Is it up there with Prince? Is it up there with Snoop and Drake? Nah. But I will agree with AJ in the chat. Usher got them moves, but Usher's always had them moves. There's never been a day that Usher didn't have them moves. So, congrats to the Kansas City Chiefs. But the good news is, we're starting from scratch now, everybody. So, what can Klint Kubiak do for this team? Number one, the Saints still have a lot of positions to fill on the staff. If y'all have not been keeping up with it, the Saints coaching staff is still pretty empty, right? And you have a lot of moves that are going to be happening. We'll talk about this as the season goes on. But right now, the only people on offense, Clancy Barone, your tight ends coach, Klint Kubiak, offensive coordinator, and everything else is assistants. Now, Jari Evans is still on the roster. He was the offensive line assistant. He's now just listed as an offensive assistant. There is nobody anywhere. There's been talks, as we talked about on the show last week, of Benton coming in to being the offensive line coach, but there's a literal complete overhaul of the offensive coaching staff. And while some of the assistants and the assistants of the head coach like Mike Martinez are still going to be here, it's pretty safe to say that the Sean Payton era is over when it comes to the offensive coaching staff, and honestly, pretty much the defensive coaching staff. You still have a couple of guys like Brian Young who were here at the time and Michael Hodges, but basically you finally got 3 years in what a lot of people wanted from the beginning, which is a complete overhaul and to get away from the quote-unquote Payton era. Very curious to see how this rolls out. I am unsure because one thing about Dennis, and we talked about DA about this, and I'm not trying to and I'll never try to turn this into like a revisionist history or we're promoting DA because I still don't really believe in DA. But at the same time, at least DA was more of a known. And this is the scary thing about going in. Like, this is a complete unknown, right? Like, you don't know what things are going to look like after these hires. You don't know who all he's going to bring in with him. And that's a good thing because I think the Saints have needed this. But at the same time, it is scary, right? It is definitely scary. So Klint Kubiak is definitely a play caller that a lot of people in the NFL wanted for their teams. A lot of teams were looking at. This is him getting his shot to go off on his own. For those that don't remember, he did have a singular season as the OC with Minnesota. I thought he did a good job. And then when Zimmer got canned, he by default got canned because when a head coach gets fired, generally it doesn't matter how well you were doing. The entire situation gets upended. And what New Orleans did is, I would call pretty rare to have a head coach take over and keep most of the staff, but he was an in-house guy. So you now have that full overhaul, and I'll go ahead and say this ahead of time. Don't expect an immediate transition to success. Just like we talked about when DA came and took over the defense. It took time for that system to get put in place and for the players to adapt. And I hate to be that guy, but you're going to have to cut guys like Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Derek Carr some slack a little bit because truth is, even though I am truthfully, I honest to God, I'm excited about Klint Kubiak coming to the New Orleans Saints. It's unrealistic to expect everybody to be ready to go week one, system installed, system ready, and everybody's got it perfected. So there's probably going to be a little bit of a growing pain here. But at the same time, I think this has the potential to finally put this team back in the playoffs. I'm very curious to see what they do in terms of player acquisition here in the offseason and in the draft. And we've already seen folks start talking about mock drafts. Mock draft season is here. You can hit mock drafts. Like if you Google mock drafts, you will find a plethora from everything from Pro Football Focus to CBS Sports and, freaking Acme Packing Company, which is a SB Nation Packers site. You are able to find them all over the place, and you will find differing opinions on who the New Orleans Saints should go and draft. I think the New Orleans Saints probably would be wise to address offensive defensive line. It doesn't mean that there aren't quarterbacks out there that they could absolutely go for. I've definitely seen Fashanu go to the New Orleans Saints in multiple drafts. For those who don't know who that is the offensive tackle out of Penn State. I do believe that he is a pretty quality guy. He is in some ways the opposite of Trevor Penning. What I mean by that is Trevor Penning was a physical dominant force. Like you could see how strong he was and everything. It's kind of the opposite with Fashanu because where Penning lacked technique, Fashanu has technique, but maybe isn't the strongest offensive tackle. I'm very curious to see some of those measurements, like how many reps does he get at the bench press? Probably not going to be the strongest dude, but much more technical and probably able to come in and contribute immediately. And that's just a singular example. Again, you can Google mock drafts, and we'll do plenty of these ourselves here on the show. I like to do them with y'all when we do the show. We'll do it, live, and for those who listen afterwards, y'all can enjoy it after the fact. But after we go through this, I think that you're going to see a lot of, and what I would say is a good position for New Orleans to be in, because maybe they go after Leitu, the edge rusher out of UCLA. I don't think that's a wrong option. Maybe they go after an offensive tackle. Definitely not a wrong option. New Orleans is in a good spot. Sure, we all would love, in theory, to have a top 5, top 10 pick, but I guarantee you, of the 70 people listening to the show live right now, promise you, most of you would rather have had this 9-8 season than to be 3-13 and have the number 1 pick, or 3-14 have the number 1 pick. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You don't want to be a team that's completely terrible at the bottom end of the spectrum, but you also want to be able to get a decent spot. I'm actually surprised that New Orleans has a top 15 pick being 9-8. That speaks to several different points that we won't go into, but New Orleans is a top 15 pick and still were a quote unquote winning team. And thankfully, New Orleans Saints are in a better position cap-wise this year than they were a couple years ago. Sure, they still have the New Orleans Saints typical negative $80 million, but a couple years ago they were negative $100 million. They actually have made slight improvements to that, and we'll see what all they end up doing moving forward. Now, still very curious, will they trade Marshon Lattimore? And if they do, what could that translate to when it comes to things like second-round picks, third-round picks? What would they get for that? It's certainly something that I'm very curious about. And I'm not trying to say that I want to get rid of Marshon Lattimore, but I do think that if there is something that they could do that could get them some draft capital, that would make sense, right? And it's not something that I'm trying to push, because I think the worst thing that happens is you have Marshon Lattimore as your starting cornerback, but he's still in his prime, coming off 2 injured seasons. If you could flip him before that big contract, eats you later on, that seems to be the position they put themselves in with how they did his extension. They have 2 stud corners lined up right behind him who are healthy, have depth there, and it's one of the few pieces they can move that would not only help them cap-wise, but also get them draft capital so they can start rebuilding this team. And more than anything, I think the New Orleans Saints need draft picks, as in numbers, as in literally throw several darts at a dartboard and hit half of them, and you will be good. Doesn't mean that you necessarily want to do that, but it's an option. And I think it's a good option depending on what the capital is that you would get for it. Now, if somebody just simply offers you a straight third-round pick, I would pass. But anything that starts getting into that day 1, day 2 territory certainly is something worth considering, assuming that Mickey Loomis doesn't default to saying, hey, we'll take your third-round pick, but we'll give you 3/4 and Marshon Lattimore, because he seems to just give away stuff for no reason. That's just my opinion. But we'll wait and see. And again, we have people in the chat, Gerald being very loud, do not trade Lattimore. And see, I don't think that keeping Lattimore is something that is a must-do. I think it would actually be a very smart move, depending on the compensation, to move off of Lattimore. It's one of the few times you can flip a guy and not necessarily worry about, will your team be worse without him? I think Lattimore is still a high-end player. I really do. I think Lattimore is getting to the end of being a high-end player, but he's got a contract that's a high-end for several more years. And coming into this season, he's about to turn 28 years old in May. So he still has years of good play if he can be healthy. But he's not been healthy since 2021. Over the past 2 years, he's had a combined 17 games. So he's basically missed an entire season. That's not, again, I don't blame players for injuries, but just because I'm not blaming him for being injured doesn't mean the situation isn't conducive to thinking about trading, especially if you can get something valuable for him. And again, the worst thing that happens is you keep Marshawn Lattimore and you have an elite player. Now, he was healthy most of his career, right? So he was completely healthy through 2021. He's completely healthy basically the first 2 years of his career. And he's had little things that held him up here and there, and he might miss 2 games in a season. But I mean, for the first 5 years of his career, he was basically a healthy elite player. He just hasn't been that the past 2 years. And as the Saints, one thing that I feel like, and this is just my opinion, they've had a problem with in the past is being loyal to past production. And again, I'll be very clear. I am not hating on guys like Cameron Jordan. I'm not trying to hate on guys who were very great Saints who played too long. I just think that as the New Orleans Saints franchise goes, you don't have a Super Bowl head coach. You don't have a Hall of Fame quarterback. You kind of have to play things a little bit pickier. I think you got to play things a lot pickier. Because you don't have those fallback things, you can't just necessarily go, hey, look, Cam, you've fallen off a little bit. Yeah, you had some injuries and stuff. But we're going to keep you around because you're the heart and soul of this team and you're still great against the run. Maybe you start making decisions that say, look, we can't really do that anymore. We really have to focus on making sure that every player here is the best player at their position that they can be. And that is not a directed shot at Cam, because I do believe that Cam can contribute. I still believe that Cam is what Cam was. Even if he's healthy, I still think that New Orleans has to get a pass rusher, which is, if you go through the mock drafts, you'll see a lot of mock drafts saying that. In fact, CBS says the New Orleans Saints should take Letu in their latest mock draft. Pro Football Focus says in the second round, the New Orleans Saints should select Chris Broswell out of Alabama. So a lot of people all recognize that the New Orleans Saints are in desperate need of edge defenders and edge rushers. So I think Lattimore is certainly a viable option there, especially if it ends up making your offense better, what you were hoping with Klint Kubiak. But Klint Kubiak needs more than just what he has. I mean, New Orleans needs draft picks, and New Orleans needs youthful young talent. New Orleans needs people, and New Orleans needs an offensive line. Eric McCoy is a very good player. Love that he's stout there at center. I like Cesar Ruiz, who's really improved from what he was as a rookie. He's still not like it at all pro level or anything close, but he's certainly been reliable. You've got 2 tackle spots that are massive question marks, and the left guard spot that's still a question mark, unless you believe Nick Saldiveri can come in and be that guy. So and I'm just saying this, if Marshawn Lattimore turned into your starting tackle, right or left, that is a win for the New Orleans Saints. If it turned into a starting tackle on a rookie contract, which means maybe a second-round pick, that is a win if you're the New Orleans Saints. That is a huge win. That is a massive W. Now, again, if you were offering in trade only a 4th-round pick, you pass on it. But if you're really trying to say this team can win, well, I like Klint Kubiak. I really do. Y'all know that he was the main choice I had of being the offensive coordinator of the New Orleans Saints. He's the main one that I rooted for. Said, hey, look, this is the one that I think would take the Saints, or there's the best potential, rather, to take the Saints, because nothing's a certainty in this league. To that next level, he was the guy. Doesn't matter who your OC is. You got a bad offensive line, quarterback's going to perform poorly. Your wide receivers are probably not going to have the timing needed to get into the routes and have those big plays, and your running backs are going to suffer, which is what's happened to to Alvin Kamara for years now. Because if you look at Alvin Kamara, you look at his stats and go, man, he's really struggling. He had a 3.9 average last year, and 2 years ago he was 3.7. But truthfully, I think a lot of that was on the offensive line play. Whereas, look, if you look at his total yards from scrimmage, shout out to Alvin Kamara. This year, he actually just passed 10,000 yards from scrimmage, 77 touchdowns. That's awesome. Love that. If you do it by yards per carry, which is the old number of how a lot of people used to really gauge how good as a running back was yards per carry, I tend to look at yards per carry the same way I look at sacks. Sometimes that's not on who we typically blame it on. Sacks sometimes are a quarterback stat, not an offensive line stat. Yards per carry is often an offensive line stat, not a running back stat. So if you go into Alvin Kamara real quick, let me give you an example of what I'm meaning, right? So I want to elaborate on my point just a little bit, and then I promise we'll move on just a smidge. But yards before contact. This past season, Alvin Kamara averaged 2.3 yards before contact. How does that relate to Alvin Kamara, though? Like, how does that compare to historical numbers for AK? Well, for example, 2019, Latavius Murray averaged 2.7 with the Saints offensive line. In 2020, Alvin Kamara averaged 2.8 behind the New Orleans Saints offensive line. We're talking about pretty high numbers. Now, has it always been like that high? I mean, not necessarily, but I think most people who would watch the New Orleans Saints would agree that this team did not have the same, level of play that you had become used to when it comes to the offensive line. And for reference, Jamal Williams was 1.5 yards per carry or yards before contact, and Kendre Miller was 1.8. So Alvin Kamara was the best of the group, and it just wasn't good. So as a whole, I think that you have to find a way to address that. And sure, you could look at free agency, but when it comes to the offensive line, I often look at how the Eagles do it. I look at how Dallas has done it. The best offensive lines are built in-house with young talent, and you take the time to groom that talent into being the best. I think that's what good teams do. They groom their offensive and defensive lines to being the best instead of going out and just getting that one trade in. Now, you can do that, absolutely. Great example of doing that, Tunzel with the Houston Texans. Went out and got your left tackle. Absolutely a fantastic decision. Zero regrets on that. Houston actually used free agency to build their offensive line, which is fantastic. They did a great job. But in terms of what a lot of the really good teams in the NFL do, they draft their guys, they grow their guys. And you look at the teams that are known for having elite offensive line play year after year, a lot of those guys will have different people left to right of them, but the unit still performs at a high level. Now, you can do it in multiple ways. And we will go over, top, free agents. We can discuss those names and who could fit the New Orleans Saints. I think that is a brilliant idea, and we'll do that here on the show because content, but also because we want to know who's best for the Saints. But at the same time, I don't think it's required for the New Orleans Saints to go and do that. And there are some names that are immediately going to be off the list for New Orleans, right? Like we're not going to get Chris Jones. I know he just won a Super Bowl, but we know Chris Jones' whole thing was he wanted big money. So we're not going to get Chris Jones. But at the same time, there could be somebody out there that could improve the New Orleans Saints defensive line that could. If I had to pick in a dream world, I'd love Brian Burns on the New Orleans Saints. I just don't ever think that's going to happen. Absolutely not. That said, could you still end up with maybe a Bryce Huff? Possibly. You actually could. Or if you wanted to add a veteran, what about a Darius Smith? If you want to get a veteran in here. Personally, I would like to go younger, which means maybe grabbing a guy like Jonathan Greenyard from the Houston Texans, who might not have as much use for him now that they just got, the defensive rookie of the year on the edge. And that doesn't mean that I'm just trying to bargain shop, but I do think that if you're the Saints, you do have to be kind of tactical with how you make your choices. You look at what you have in Greenyard, like I just said, I'm about a guy that they'll probably end up trying to keep, and they'd be wise to. But if he hits the market, he's not the biggest name and nor the biggest price tag of who's coming out. And there are several names coming out, like Chase Young. You got to sign Chase Young. So there are multiple ways that New Orleans can attack this. I personally love when you spend multiple picks and you have somebody in-house that that can raise the offensive line and defensive line of your future. But we'll see how that ends up playing out. I'm very curious. But I definitely want to give Klint Kubiak the support he needs, and that comes with letting him pick his coaching staff and trusting him to know what he's doing there, and then letting him install an offense, but giving him the talent for that offense to have success. We talk about this Super Bowl that just happened, and even though the 49ers lost, I think many of us would watch Christian McCaffrey in that game and go, this is everything that we wanted from Alvin Kamara. Not just how they were using him, but just seeing him in a Super Bowl being effective. It's everything we wanted for Alvin Kamara. And he's not had that opportunity. And I get that Christian McCaffrey maybe wasn't amazing because his stat sheet's not amazing. But they leaned heavily on Christian McCaffrey. He had 160 yards in that Super Bowl. He didn't win, but had San Francisco won, and if I had a vote, who would have I voted for the player of the game, Super Bowl MVP for the 49ers? I would have said Christian McCaffrey's the guy. Definitely wasn't Brock Purdy. I thought Brock Purdy is exactly what I said Brock Purdy was. He is a mid-tier quarterback who works really well in a great system. There's nothing wrong with that. Patrick Mahomes showed that even with his interception throw, that dude's not so good. So You got to have the ability to do that, right? And I think we'll see if New Orleans gets there. And I know we kind of rabbit trailed like really hardcore from the whole Marshawn Lattimore getting traded thing, but that kind of plays into it. I mean, if you have the ability to build from that, you do it, but only because you have Paulson Debo and Alante Taylor, who are both, good few years younger and who are up and coming, cheap talents, cheap because they're on rookie contracts. You absolutely do it. Now, if you did not have that, it would be like if you're going back to, the mid 2010s team and just saying, hey, get rid of Jabari Greer, just get rid of, Keenan Lewis. If you didn't have anybody behind him, you absolutely don't do that. New Orleans does have two young guys who are good behind him. And if I was New Orleans, I am fielding calls for Marshawn Lattimore, but only taking it if it's a good deal. And I'm only fielding calls because I know that if I want this team to be better, it needs a serious talent infusion, and especially upon the most important area of the football, the trenches. Because both sides of the defensive and offensive, or both sides of the line for New Orleans, need a lot of help. They both need a lot of help. Will they get it? I will say this. We talked about this at the same time last offseason, a little bit later, obviously. But if y'all remember during last offseason, I said the New Orleans Saints, aside from changing the coaching staff, did everything I could legitimately think of them doing roster-wise 2023 offseason. I really feel like they hit everything. Between free agent draft, they hit every need. Doesn't necessarily mean I think that every player they hit was like, oh, nailed it. But they didn't leave anything that was a need or need to be addressed unaddressed. They addressed everything. And I believe they'll do the same thing here. Hopefully, right? I think the New Orleans Saints will do the same strategy here. They will address everything that they need to address. The only real question for me after that comes down to how do they address it? Like, for example, do they do it in free agency? Do they do it in the draft? Do they do it a mix? Because, for example, there are not a ton, I would say, offensive linemen available, because I know one name that comes to mind is like Michael Onwenu from New England. He's still young, and he's hitting free agency as an interior offensive lineman. But he's a really power type of a guy. He's like a 6'4", 350-pound, barrel-chested. Doesn't really fit the whole outside zone Klint Kubiak we assume is going to run system. So I don't feel like there's as many options in free agency that at least are big names. Maybe Kevin Dotson from the Rams, if the Rams choose to not re-sign him. He's a guard, that I feel like fits the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, playing with McVay, you have a very similar system in terms of like the basics of West Coast. That doesn't mean they run identical systems. There's you a name, but again, are they going to let a 27-year-old decent offensive lineman just go and leave? We'll see. We will have to wait and see. But I am very curious what they choose to do, because I think last year they showed that they could address everything, even if they didn't necessarily address it in the way you wanted. Because last year, if people said, hey, can I choose between Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr? Most fans would say choose Aaron Rodgers. Well, they didn't do that. They didn't go after Aaron Rodgers like the Jets did. But they did go after Derek Carr. But they still addressed everything of need. And if they follow that same pattern into this offseason, which is the right move to make, then we'll see them address multiple offensive lines. As in, they might get one guy in free agency and one guy in the draft. They're going to get multiple players at that position. And hopefully you don't have the issue like what happened with Trey Turner this past offseason, which, if y'all remember, I was very excited about that signing. That was a veteran offensive line signing that I thought could actually spend time on the field and contribute, who sadly got knocked out before he could ever wear the Saints uniform, at least on the field. Nantu says that when your draft picks don't pan out, that's a lot. Penning hasn't done anything or the guard they picked last year. I don't even know if Penning fits what they need on the offensive line. Now, I'm not going to get upset about the Saldiveri pick, because the Saldiveri was a mid-round pick that had to be developed. Sure, you missed on Penning, but as I've said, I believe the New Orleans Saints have done really good drafting. They just haven't drafted enough. And then if you get Dennis Allen to stop hand-picking defensive ends that he believes are going to work, be fine. I feel like the Saints still develop really well. I feel like they draft really well. But there are two specific glaring, stop doing that. The number one, stop doing that, in my opinion, is stop doing Dennis Allen's stupid defensive end prototype that has slight injury history and goobles and goobles of upside, but isn't ready to compete day one. Stop that. Stop drafting that. Draft Brian Brzee, who's ready to go right now. even if he doesn't have the upside that the Jalen Carter does. Obviously, Carter wasn't an option, but you know what I mean. So stop doing that. Like, stop drafting Trevor Penning, even though he's got oobles and goobles of potential. Draft a guy who's ready to go. But after that, I really believe this team has done very well developing guys into quality starters. And I guess it depends on what your, expectations are. I mean, if your expectations are developing guys into all pros and pro bowlers, maybe New Orleans has fallen off a little bit in that regard. But truthfully, I think it goes back to my biggest contention, which is draft a lot of folks. And the Saints haven't been drafting a lot of folks. In 2022, they drafted 5 guys. That's it. 5. 2 of those top 3 are great starters. Alontae Taylor, Chris Olave. Chris Olave is great. Alontae Taylor is good. Trevor Penning, I hope it works out this year. I hope. Trevor's angry tonight? I'm not angry. I feel like I'm just having fun because I love football and I love y'all. I'm not angry, though. Do I sound angry? I should probably check my tone then. I'm not upset. I just want the New Orleans Saints to be Super Bowl champion. Yeah? I watched the Super Bowl and I'm like, hey, be nice if my team won one of these again. Be nice. We'll see. We need to stop dealing with Dennis Allen regardless. I mean, we can say that, Nelly, but let's just be honest. That's not going to happen this year. So I'm not going to spend a year talking about we shouldn't be dealing with Dennis Allen because there's no point. There's no point. He's here and he's not going anywhere. So you go into the season as if Dennis Allen is the option. Go into the season as if Dennis Allen is the only chance you have of the Super Bowl. And how can you reach that with Dennis Allen there? And if you can't even envision a potential possibility, that's fine. I'm not going to spend all of 2024 going and get rid of Dennis Allen. This is not going to happen. Maybe 2025 we can do that. Maybe. We'll see how this year goes. So, Cool Sports says, I agree. Brian Brzee is a beast. He should have got more snaps during the season, in my opinion. He did better than Shepard and Saunders when he played. I mean, he did get a lot of snaps. How many snaps do you think he should get? Because Kalen Saunders plays a different position than Brian Brzee, so you shouldn't even bring up Colin Saunders when it comes to Brzee's snaps. So they played 2 different positions. Now, you are correct in that Shepard was the starter for most of the season. However, if we go by game logs and go by how much Brzee got in terms of snaps, he actually did get increasingly more as the season went on. Example, week 1, he saw 41% of the snaps. Week 17, he saw 57% of the snaps. In fact, going by about the last 6 weeks of the season, he was the full-time starter. Now, he might not come up as the full-time starter when you look at Pro Football Reference or something like that. And the reason is because to denote a full-time starter, let me explain how it works. Fun fact you learn in sports journalism, and it's stupid logic. Here's how you were determined to be the starter each game. Were you on the field for the first offensive snap and the first defensive snap? So, like, if Nate Shepard came in and was literally on the field the first snap, and that's it, and then left the field, he was the starter, even if Brzee had 60 snaps. Right? Now, Shepard still, I feel like, did really well as a rotational guy. And he was the predominant starter, week 1 having 51% of the snaps. But for example, against the New York Giants, he had 48%. Against the Carolina Panthers, he had 43%, where you saw Brzee have more snaps than that. And then in the last game of the year against Atlanta, you saw them on the field together a lot. So he had around 60%. So he definitely had good snaps, but I would also point out that Shepard was a good player. But also Brian Brzee is like the future, right? So I think that he got better as the season went on. Brzee did. Could I have argued for more snaps? Sure. But the fact that he set the team's rookie defensive tackle sack record says a lot. And I also don't want to disregard Nate Shepard because he too had, 3.5 sacks for the New Orleans Saints. He contributed a great deal and did, I say, a good job as a rotational guy coming in from New York. And he's 30 years old. He's a veteran. So he's not going to do that for a long time. But I just want to point out that I think that he did a good job. Both of them did. And clearly, Brzee is the 3-tech of the future. Clearly, he's the 3-tech of the future. Thus, as the way the script being written, I would assume a bare minimum making the playoffs next season. Hey, if that's the script, where we actually get back in the playoffs after 3 years, y'all are going to hate me, but I'm happy about that. Even if that means Dennis Allen, y'all can go ahead and hate me. Don't unfollow the channel, but I'm going to say it right here loud and proud. If you told me that if I had to have Dennis Allen in 2025, but my reward was I got the playoffs this year, that was my trade off, give me the playoffs. Give me a chance. Just give me a chance. Because you will not convince me the New Orleans Saints this season in the playoffs couldn't have beat the Philadelphia Eagles. Could we have beat the Lions? I don't think so. Could we have beat the 49ers? I don't think so. But could we have beat the Philadelphia Eagles? Yes. If Tampa could do it, so could New Orleans. I 100% believe New Orleans would have beat Philly because Philly just sucked for whatever reason the past 2 months. You'll never convince me, never make an argument that makes me believe that's not the case. So, would I take the playoffs? I will always take the playoffs. Philly says Tampa's better than us? No, they weren't. No, they weren't. They were absolutely not. No, they weren't. That's lies and poppycock. If you want to believe it, you can believe whatever you want. That's the beauty of opinions. We are all allowed to have them, but the New Orleans Saints were way better at the end of the season than Tampa was. Evidenced by that, we beat the tar out of them in Week 16. That doesn't mean that the New Orleans Saints were going to make the Super Bowl, but they definitely would have beat Philly. Definitely would have beat Philly. So, yeah. O-line coach Jim Turner is a must-get. I actually don't have a favorite for O-line coach. Believe it or not, I don't have a favorite for O-line coach. I'm curious how that ends up going. Like, who ends up being the guy? Who do they end up choosing? What do they end up going with? But as we said in the beginning of the show, they've got to replace wide receiver coach, quarterback coach, offensive line coach, running back coach. Got a lot they got to fill in. Quite a few. So we'll see. Who had better stats, Carter or Brian? Carter. I mean, Carter went off, and Carter was on, again, one thing that Philly has done really, really well is their trench play. I'm not saying that Jalen Hurts is overrated, but I am saying that he's not an elite quarterback like a Mahomes is. He's still a good one. But Carter is, you could tell he was special, but he's already playing on a defensive line that has had many special guys over like the past 5 or 6 years. And when I say many special guys, I mean that their defensive line, literally for about the past 6 years, I'm just thinking of all the names, has been an elite defensive line. Like, you know, they had Hassan Reddick on the team this year, right? He was a double-digit sack guy. And then Josh Sweat, defensive end, had like 7. And then Jalen Carter had 6. He was playing on a team that still had Fletcher Cox, by the way. Veteran Fletcher Cox is still in the league to this day. He was, what was Fletcher Cox, like 33 years old? He's definitely got over a decade on Jalen Carter. But he still put in more sacks than Brzee did. I think he had 5 sacks. I mean, you talk about one of the most dominant 3 techs ever, Fletcher Cox. Fletcher Cox literally has a argument for the best 3 tech of all time based on longevity. He's kind of the Cameron Jordan of 3 techs. I mean, it just, or hell, the Mike Evans of 3 techs. He necessarily wasn't like, or he wasn't necessarily the best at one time. Like, he wasn't ever better than Aaron Donald. But the dude has been just nuts for like 12, 13 years at the same spot. That's just really impressive. But anyway, the point I'm making is Carter was better, but that doesn't mean that Brzee was not great. That doesn't mean that Brzee was not great. Brzee did fantastic. I would not besmirch him in any way. Carter was the better prospect coming out. I don't think many people would argue that point, that Carter was a better prospect coming out. But Brzee did well. If anything, I would say Brzee did better than expected. So I think he'd do better than expected. PBM says, why wouldn't the Saints have gone to the Super Bowl? They would have beat Dallas or Philly and gave San Francisco a run. You want me to give you the straight answer? I'll give you the straight answer. Yes, I believe the New Orleans Saints would have beat the Philadelphia Eagles, but that's mostly because the Philadelphia Eagles sucked for the last 2 months of the year. I'm just keep it real. I don't believe in Derek Carr enough to single-handedly lead this team. I believe an offensive coordinator or offensive head coach has to elevate a Derek Carr. I don't think Derek Carr can do it by himself. So he's not leading this team in the playoffs by himself with a subpar coordinator, which is what New Orleans had. If you're going to take a mid-tier quarterback to that next level, the coaching's got to be what's great. And people can dunk on Shanahan all they want. Kyle Shanahan has gone to the Super Bowl 3 times in the past decade. Sure, it hasn't been closed out, and y'all can gripe at him all you want. I don't understand how people even think that's an insult. Like, people are literally insulting Shanahan. Oh, he can't close it out in the Super Bowl. The dude went to the Super Bowl 3 times. Like, once as the offensive coordinator, 2 as a head coach. Like, we really trying to dunk on this dude for going to the Super Bowl 3 times in a decade? Like, what is this world? But if you're going to be able to elevate a guy, like elevate a mid-tier quarterback, you've got to have a great head coach or offensive mind to do that. And New Orleans didn't have that last year. So I don't believe Derek Carr could have done it. And I don't believe in Dennis Allen as a leader of men to elevate that team like you saw Dan Campbell do with the Lions. That's why I personally don't think that they would have got far in the playoffs. That's just you asked my opinion, that's what I think, PBM. But it's all conjecture, right? It's 100% conjecture. 100%. So, yeah, Jerry, the 28-3 is forever. It is, but even then, man, I was going to keep it real with y'all. If you told me that the Saints could go to the Super Bowl 3 times, even if they lost, I would still want the Saints to have the opportunity to win. Like, I'm not going to try to dunk on Kyle Shanahan because, oh, you went to the Super Bowl 3 times and didn't win it. Like, okay, name every team that has not gone to the Super Bowl in the past 20 years. I ain't even gotten to get there. Like, I want to play in the game and have a shot. I want to have a shot. I mean, anyway, that's just my thoughts and opinions. Shanahan went against a better offensive coach than Mahomes. 992. I do think that Andy Reid has a legitimate argument up there with the Walsh and the Belichick's his best head coach of all time. I legit think he does. The reason I think Andy Reid might be even better potentially is he's taken 2 teams to the Super Bowl, right? Now, Andy didn't win it when he took the Philadelphia Eagles, but he took the Philadelphia Eagles to the Super Bowl, and then he's taken the Kansas City Chiefs. So it's not like he had this one team he turned to a juggernaut. He's done it twice. That's special and impressive to me. But it's not even that I think Andy Reid is that much better than Kyle Shanahan. I think Patrick Mahomes is that much better than Brock Purdy and Jimmy Garoppolo and everything. And beyond that, if y'all listen to the post game of the Super Bowl, the interviews, how the fact that the San Francisco 49ers didn't even know the overtime rules, but the freaking Chiefs were talking about that in training camp. It's just a paradigm. It's a mindset that winners and really good people have and experienced guys have that others just didn't, right? I bet you San Francisco knows what they are if they get back. I bet you they know if they get back what it is. Probably. They probably know what it is when they get back. So, we'll see. Also, Kansas City didn't handicap themselves with cap help. They let Hill go so they could rebuild the defense. I don't believe cap help exists unless a team doesn't know how to operate inside of it, like New Orleans does. But I don't know how all 32 teams run their system, so I can't really speak on that in a way that is educated. So I'm pretty ignorant to how all 32 teams run their front office. But losing Tyreek Hill did not prevent them from winning the Super Bowl. And that definitely does speak to how well they are with talent acquisition. Because Rashee Rice as a rookie is definitely not as good as Tyreek Hill. But he's a hell of a lot cheaper. And he was pretty damn good in the playoffs. How was he good? He set the NFL record for rookie catches in the playoffs. That's pretty impressive. So that's pretty impressive. So NTR says the Kubiak scheme requires major changes to the O-line. Would you predict cuts or trades? I would not expect any cuts because there's nobody to really cut, right? The whole Ryan Ramczyk thing is he so injured that he retires? I don't know if you would cut Ryan Ramczyk. You could definitely try to trade for something. I just don't know who that option would really be. We can explore that. The deeper we get into the offseason, the more time we as a community here with Who Dat Confessional can spend together and talk about names like in the Discord and on Twitter and really kind of like investigate who could actually fit here. Like I said earlier, there's a free agent from the Los Angeles Rams that's a guard that New Orleans could maybe take a look at. Whether they go after him, obviously I can't say specifically, but maybe they go after a Kevin Dotson. Free agent, still young. I think he's an effective player. Maybe they go after Dotson. I don't necessarily think he's amazing, but I think he's an effective player. And has a kind of a natural fit there. Randall says, Deuce, I wouldn't call the Saints kicking the can down the road a good thing. It only ensures we stay in cap hell for the future. Again, I don't believe cap hell's a thing. I don't believe in cap hell. Cap hell's not real. Cap hell's not real. Cap hell is only real if it prevents you from making the moves you want to make. New Orleans has not been preventing from making any moves they wanted to make except for 2020 in the COVID season when the cap actually went backwards instead of forwards. That hurt them. So unless you know of another pandemic happening, I'm not worried. The New Orleans Saints operate in a certain way, and there is no such thing as cap hell if you can make all the moves you want to make. And they literally have not had moves they couldn't make. There's nobody. Now, there's some decisions that they made that were stupid. For example, Trey Hendrickson letting him walk when they absolutely could have afforded him, but they wanted to go with Davenport. But it wasn't a money thing. They could have afforded him. They chose not to. So we can definitely come at them for being bad in some of their decisions, but I don't believe New Orleans is in cap hell until they are unable to make the moves. Like we hear and know they want to go after this player, but they literally can't afford it. I don't believe in cap hell for New Orleans. So 902 says paying Carr $150 million wasn't great. I have zero issue with it. Carr's contract is fantastic. I love Carr's contract. If you think that you can get a player like Derek Carr not for $150 million, you're delusional. I'm not even trying to be insulting. Like literally, Daniel Jones is making more than Derek Carr and is a worse quarterback. That's simply the market. That's the market. But if you look at how that contract is set up, one, Derek Carr is not going to get $150 million. And two, it is set up really, really well for the New Orleans Saints. I love Derek Carr's contract. For those that don't remember it, I'll pull it up for you again real quick. I love Carr's contract. So, put it up here. Put it on the screen for those that want to view it. Derek Carr's contract, this season, he'll have a cap hit of $52.8 million. But if you look at his contract was basically set up as a 2-year deal with a 3rd-year option and then an immediate out after 3 no matter what. So literally after 3 years, they get out, no big deal. Oh well, who cares? But really they had it set up to where they can get out of it after 2 if they wanted to. So if Derek Carr didn't work out and literally was a glorified bridge quarterback, they had set themselves up to be able to move out of him after 2 if they needed to. I love this contract set. It's the opposite of what you see them do with a lot of their contracts. They had a lot of front load on this contract, and they set it up between the options, bonuses, and everything else that, yeah, on paper, it's 150. What is it really? It's a 3-year contract with the potential of going as little as 2 years if they're willing to take a hit and get rid of it. I love Derek Carr's contract because if you're going to sign a mid-tier quarterback, especially who's probably going to operate mostly as a bridge, that's exactly how you want to do it. Exactly how you want to do it. I love that contract. There are contracts I really dislike with the New Orleans Saints. Cameron Jordan is a contract I don't like. I don't like Cameron Jordan's contract. I guess I can put that one on the screen. But I really like the Derek Carr contract because it didn't tie the New Orleans Saints to another large quarterback contract. And coming into this season, I'm pretty sure Derek Carr for 2024 is going to be like the 14th, 15th highest paid quarterback in the NFL. I'll take that all day long. Because I don't believe in Derek Carr. It's like, I don't believe Derek Carr is a top guy. So if you're going to get a starter caliber quarterback, what Derek Carr is, that's a good contract. Now, if the argument is that you don't believe in Derek Carr and you didn't ever want to get him, that's a different conversation. I'm specifically talking about the contract. Like, if your argument is they should have never gotten Derek Carr and they should just let themselves suck and then drafted, that's fine. I'll let you have that. That's cool. You can want them to do that. We're talking about how they did the contract. I have zero issue with Derek Carr's contract. I don't have any issue with Derek Carr. Well, it's contract. Nelly says Carr talent isn't the issue either. He's not fit for the city culture-wise, but he's still the definition of an above-average quarterback. There's definitely a fit issue one way or another. I'll definitely agree with you in that. Who's my dream first-round pick? I'll be honest, I don't really have a dream first-round pick. There's a bubble of like a cloud of 6 names I'd be pretty happy with. So, but we'll see what that name looks like after we do another 2 months of studying. Right? 992 says they're going to extend it to get under cap. They'll push a lot of money in the last 2 years. He'll be there for a lot more. We'll see. There's no guarantee for that though, 992. Because you talk about extending to buy cap. You only do the extension type of work if you have to. That contract doesn't have to. In 2025, if you wanted to cut him, and you don't have to cut him, your dead cap's like $12 million. You'll eat that. That's fine. In terms of quarterback contracts, I'm not saying you just want to eat $12 million in dead, but you want an example real quick? You know what Cameron Jordan's dead cap is, not counting the 2 phantom years he already has on the books? 2025, his dead cap is $18 million. I'm sorry, his cap hits $18 million, his dead is $13. And that doesn't count the fact that he has an already existing, nothing you can do about it, $7.8 million dead in 2026 when he doesn't even have a contract. It's phantom years. There's a phantom dead hit right there. And nothing you can do about it. I'm not trying to just dunk on Cameron Jordan right now, but how they did New Orleans, you will definitely take that as a potential out, right? Because 2026 dead cap, let's say he plays 3 years. The 2026 dead cap number is $11 million. That's it. I'll live with that. And that's if they don't do any phantom extensions for 2027 and stuff like that. We'll take it. So, and then, well, technically 2026 because, no, 2027. Yeah, 2027. Because 2026 will be year 4, which is a real year if they choose it. And then 2027 was a built-in phantom. So, yeah. And by the way, that 2027 built-in phantom, 5.7 mil dead. If they make it that far. I'll live with that. I'll live with that. I really will. It's the Cameron Jordan type contracts. And again, I'm not trying to dump on Cameron Jordan because I love him, man. But it's the Cameron Jordan type contracts that make me go like, gosh, that hurts. Because you kind of do have to extend into like 38 years old. I don't like those. Those are like the ones that like, gosh, that stings a little bit. You know, the fact that example, Honey Badger, he has a dead cap with a phantom year. So his phantom dead cap in 2025 is 7.3 dead. No matter what, 7.3. And that's a safety, not a quarterback. So those are the ones you got to worry about. Those are the ones you got to worry about. That's the thing, Billy. Like, if you worry about the Saints cap, you have not been paying attention to the Saints cap. Like, they're fine. So the Saints every year, because people worry about, oh, that's a dead number. The Saints every year have got dead stuff. Drew Brees has been on your roster cap-wise. That's just how the Saints play it. As long as there is a future year, you're fine. The best way I think that you can like layman's term it is you're simply borrowing from the future. It's still there. As long as the future doesn't disappear, you're fine. The only time it's ever hurt New Orleans is when the future disappeared in COVID. I mean, it went backwards. That's the only time it hurts you. Now and again, I've never said that there aren't risks to it. There's definitely risk. Those are the risks. But it only hurts you if you move backwards. As long as there's a future NFL, you're fine. Right? 2024. Let's talk about who's already dead. Like James Hurst. He's a 3.5 dead no matter what. But let's talk about last year because who was a hit last year? Let's grab some names that weren't even on the team. Gosh, I thought that said Stanley Jean-Baptiste. I was like, what in the world? Sorry, that scared me a little bit. I thought that said Stanley Jean-Baptiste. It was Shamar Jean-Charles that had a dead cap number with us last year but didn't play. Sorry, y'all. My brain freaked out and went, what the heck? That's what happens. That's what happens when you get old, ladies and gentlemen. Don't get old. If you're out there, avoid getting old if at all possible. Avoid getting old. All right. Gosh, Jameis Winston cost more than I thought he did. We can pull up. How long did Breeze? Does it still have it listed? How long Breeze lasted on after he was done? Was it 2 years? They don't have it listed anymore. They did it when the contract was active, but they don't have it listed now that he's retired. But anyway, so he wasn't on last year's. He was already off, but you keep getting younger, you'll never grow up. I love that 992. I love that. I love that 992. I believe they have a book for about that. Maybe Benjamin Button. Is that the name? Benjamin Button. I think they got a whole book and everything. Whole book and everything. Yeah. Yeah, 2022 was Drew Brees' last dead year, and that was 11.5. So 2022 was Drew Brees' last dead year, and it was 11.5. Yeah. 2022. So even more to my point about how they did the Derek Carr thing right, literally what would end up being, because 2022, if we talked about it being 2026, literally 4 years later, Derek Carr's quarterback cap hit, if he did have any type of like just gone, is less than what Drew Brees was. And Drew Brees had 2 years of cap charges of 11 million, 2021 and 2022. Obviously, Drew Brees' last season, 2020. So 2 years, he was on the books for 11.5. Derek Carr is less than that for 1 year if they even make it to that point and don't do anything with it. So that is a better use of your money when it comes to a quarterback contract, in my opinion. And to be clear, he doesn't actually make any of that money. He already made the money, but it has to go on the books, right? Like, so he didn't get a check from the New Orleans Saints for 11 million. He had already made the money. They had simply pushed where the debt is down the road. And in theory, they could have done that indefinitely. In theory, you could do it indefinitely. I don't think there's a rule between making it like 10 years down the road. I don't think that you'd want to do that. But there is a history of that happening. What was it, the baseball player that had it set to where he got paid for like the next 20 or 30 years? I'd have to remember who that was. I don't remember. But I do have to say this. It's been a great episode. I think y'all are awesome. We got to wrap it up. We are going to be back Thursday for another edition of the Kubiak Confessional podcast. It's about an hour, so you got to wrap it. I do appreciate every single one of you. All are amazing. All are wonderful. I hope you had a great time. If you did, smack the like button. That helps out the channel. And share out Kubiak Confessional with your friends. Who dat to you. God bless. Catch you on the next one Thursday night. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of the things that Klint Kubiak and who he could potentially be adding to the New Orleans Saints coaching staff. Let's see. See you then.